Your parent called today. Maybe it was the third time this week. Maybe they called yesterday too and the day before, and the call was fine, warm, even. But somewhere after you hung up, you felt something you didn't quite want to feel. Not irritation exactly, something more like the weight of it, the quiet guilt of knowing you almost didn't pick up. Because the researchers who have spent decades studying what drives older adults to reach for the phone have found something underneath that call that most adult children never get told. And once you understand it, the way you hear that ringtone changes completely. Most people assume the answer is obvious. Their parent is lonely. Their parent has too much time. Their parent doesn't realize how often they call. Some of these things can overlap with the truth. None of them is the actual mechanism, because the behavior behind the daily call isn't a personality quirk or a retirement habit. It has a name in the attachment literature, and it has been studied in enough depth that the picture it produces is specific, and once you see it, hard to mistake for anything else. In 2010, researcher Victor Ciccarelli at Purdue University published a study examining how attachment figures change as people age. He followed 80 men and women between ages 60 and 99 and asked each of them to identify specifically who they turned to for proximity seeking, for safe haven, for a secure base when things felt uncertain. The answer that kept appearing wasn't a spouse. It wasn't a close friend. The attachment figure that older adults most reliably named, especially as they moved further into later life, was an adult child. What John Bowlby called the attachment behavioral system, the biological drive to seek closeness to a specific person when the environment feels threatening, doesn't shut down in old age. It redirects, and in many cases it redirects toward you. What this means, and this is the reframe, is that the daily call isn't your parent filling time. It is, in a measurable sense, the same system that made you reach for them when you were small. The direction just reversed. They aren't calling because they have nothing better to do. They're calling because your voice has become, in their nervous system, the signal that tells them the world is still okay. That's not dependency. That's the attachment system working exactly the way it was designed to work across an entire lifespan. There is a second layer underneath this, and it explains something about the timing and the frequency that almost no one talks about. Researchers who study how aging adults experience time have found something consistent and measurable. The older a person gets, the more clearly they understand that the number of real conversations they have left is not unlimited, not in a panicked way, in a quiet biological way that reshapes what each contact is worth. Carstenson's research at Stanford showed that as perceived time horizons shorten, older adults don't become less engaged, they become more deliberate. Social networks narrow, and the relationships that remain carry more emotional density than before. The daily call doesn't happen because your parent is unaware of how often it occurs. It happens because each call now carries weight that the same call wouldn't have carried 20 years ago. They know at some level that these are the conversations that count. What they're actually asking for, underneath the updates and the questions about your week and the comfortable silences that sometimes stretch a little too long, is something that doesn't translate easily into a direct sentence. It's closer to this. Are you still there? Does the connection between us still hold? Am I still part of your life in a way that is real? Researchers who study attachment communication across the lifespan are clear that this is the function the behavior serves. The call is a proximity check. It is the adult version of a small child looking back across a playground to make sure the parent is still watching. The content of the call is almost beside the point. What the call is actually doing is confirming that the attachment figure is still accessible. In families with more than one adult child, the daily calls don't go to everyone equally. One sibling gets them more than the others. And it isn't always the one who lives closest, or who asks the most questions, or who seems most interested. Research on how older adults select and maintain attachment figures in later life is consistent here. The calls cluster around whoever provides what attachment researchers call felt security. Not just warmth, but the specific experience of being genuinely attended to, of being listened to without the conversation being redirected, of having your presence treated as something that matters rather than something to be managed. The parent who calls you most isn't doing it randomly. Something in how you respond makes the attachment system quiet down faster. That isn't a burden placed on you. That is a form of trust so specific it has a name in the research literature. Here's what none of this actually is: neediness. Because the behavior has a biological architecture that goes back to Bowlby's original framework, and his framework wasn't about weakness or excessive dependence. It was about survival. The attachment system evolved because maintaining closeness to a trusted person when the environment is uncertain is one of the most effective strategies a nervous system has ever developed, and older adults face genuinely uncertain environments, health that shifts in ways that are hard to predict, friends who disappear, a world moving at a speed their feet can't quite match. Against that backdrop, reaching for the person whose presence means safety isn't irrational. It is the most rational thing the brain knows how to do when the variables stop feeling controllable. Cacioppo's research at the University of Chicago adds something that makes this even harder to dismiss. His work found that perceived social isolation in older adults carries health consequences comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It raises blood pressure, accelerates cognitive decline, and is one of the strongest predictors of early mortality in studies that followed people over years. What that tells us in practical terms is that the drive behind the daily call is not just emotional, it is physiological. It is the body using the only tool it knows reliably works: contact with someone who matters. The call is not just reaching out, it is the system trying to keep itself alive. Most parents who call every day are doing exactly what a healthy attachment system looks like in later life. But there is one distinction worth knowing, because it changes what the call means and whether anything needs to change. Research on aging and attachment separates two patterns that look identical from the outside: a parent who calls from a place of genuine connection, and a parent whose calls come from a place of dysregulation that the call itself cannot resolve. The first can end a conversation feeling settled. There's an ease to the goodbye. The anxiety, whatever was present at the start, has quieted. The second ends calls still reaching. The need doesn't ease after contact. It sometimes compounds. These are different systems producing different behavior, and they need different responses. The first pattern, which is where most daily calls live, doesn't need to be solved. It needs to be understood, because the moment you understand what the call is actually doing, something about the weight of it shifts. Not the frequency, the meaning. The call that felt like an obligation starts to read as something else when you know what it's carrying. So the next time your parent calls, here is what is actually happening. Their attachment system, the same one Bowlby described in children, has identified you as a primary source of felt security in later life. Their brain, running a mechanism designed across millions of years to protect against the dangers of being alone, is doing exactly what that mechanism was built to do. And the question beneath the call, the one they will never say directly, is the simplest question one person can ask of another. It's just, are you still there? They needed to hear your voice to know the answer. That's not too much. That's everything. If this changed how you feel when the phone rings, subscribe and leave a comment below. Does your parent call you more than your siblings? Because the reason behind that pattern is more specific than most people realize. That's the next video.